Hello, fellow kids. Let's talk about hardcore punk from 2023. Hey, welcome back to Ground Zero Salem. As always, I'm your host, Pat. So, once again, kind of getting back in the saddle. I kind of feel like I'm in a time loop here. This happens to me regularly where I don't make content for a very long time for varying reasons. Life always does get in the way, being an adult and a grown-up and responsible, and all that kind of stuff, but often it's motivation. And I feel like I've got some inertia going. You know, the boulder is... Sisyphus has finally reached the top of the mountain, which never happened in actual legend, of course, and now the boulder's starting to roll downhill, which is good. Hopefully I can keep that up when I'm back to working full-time overnights next week. Anyway, enough about me. You don't want to hear about me, other than what I think of records, hopefully. I got that grindcore thing out of the way. I've been wanting to record that for quite a while. Looks like it's doing pretty well, at least by my channel standards, so new people, thanks for checking it out. Please, if you like what you see, subscribe. If not, don't feel obligated to. Click the bell, click the thumbs thing. It's the internet. Yay. I wanted to do a couple other topics because 2023 was a great year for music. There's a lot of great hardcore punk that comes out and that also is really big in this area. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, or in a suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina, and there's been just a great scene here. I've moved here from Boston in 2021, and I was very spoiled living in Boston. Lots of music comes through Boston, metal, hardcore, and otherwise. And if I were to uproot myself and land anywhere, I think this is probably the best possible place for me. It's a small town, small college town, which is what I'm used to. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, so I feel very at home in Raleigh, and it's got a great scene, great record store, Sorry State, lots of good shows. I got to see a lot of bands this year. There was a great fest that happened downtown, Sorry State's 10th anniversary label and record store fest that featured a bunch of bands that I'm going to be talking about. And although I don't get out much, whenever I get to a show, it's usually a banger. Again, I'm going to be talking about a bunch of the bands that put out great records this year that I saw live. It was difficult for me to pick out just 10 hardcore punk records, so I didn't. I think I've got like 11 or 12 LPs and then a handful of tapes and a 7-inch to talk about. And I wanted to keep things kind of in the realm of true, fast, angry hardcore punk. I think there's been a lot of technological advances as far as hardcore punk goes over the past 20 years. It's funny, I have all my records more or less arranged by subgenre, and I have 80s hardcore punk, and then after it, 90s and beyond hardcore punk. And to me, it's got to be dirty, usually fast, somewhat political or social, angry, stripped down, relatively simple kind of stuff to be considered hardcore punk. There was other stuff that went on in the 90s where the punk tag kind of fell away and it became just hardcore, and you can kind of argue about that. One thing about that particular scene, hardcore and punk and all the permutations underneath those banners, is that it doesn't really split into subgenres the same, in a clinical kind of way, the same way that metal does. Whereas with metal, you know what doom metal is, you know what death metal is. There's a lot of arguments over what really is hardcore, and you know, a lot of battling for the soul of hardcore that particularly went on in the 90s. You know, you had all this kind of post-hardcore stuff coming out on Revelation, Into Another, and Quicksand, and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of arguments over how this was even remotely related to hardcore anymore. You had all kinds of that's too metal to be hardcore kind of stuff when the Victory records, Big Pants, E-Chord, Dive Bomb kind of stuff was coming out. People were arguing that crust was more like a death metal kind of subgenre than it was a punk subgenre. There was the stuff that was kind of starting to go in an artistic emo direction that people said wasn't punk enough to be considered hardcore. A lot of those arguments are over nowadays, which is kind of nice, and people just kind of enjoy what they enjoy, which is cool. And I think all that stuff that happened in the 90s was really valid, and it wasn't just a genre study. People were exploring a new way to push the sound forward. Bands like Dead Guy and Endeavor and all these kind of discordant, noisy, metallic kind of bands and everything. What I like is bands that take this golden era of hardcore between 79 and 83 or 84 and kind of reformulate it and have more modernized recordings of it and push it in a new direction that still feels familiar. Almost feels like an uncanny valley version of old bands, or even combinations of like different sounds from different regions of the world from that golden period of hardcore. That's kind of what I'm trying to focus on with the stuff that I'm talking about right now. That's my criteria for this type of hardcore that I'm talking about, and that's why I kind of like to just call it hardcore punk. It's not as easy to just slap a label on like metal. Like I said, black metal is definitely black metal. Of course, there's a million permutations of atmospheric and depressive and all that stuff underneath that. Death metal's death metal, and there's a bunch of those, but hardcore just doesn't seem to care. It's gonna be what it is. And like I said, Raleigh's been a great town to experience a lot of good hardcore in the past couple of years I've been here, as rare as I've been able to get out of the house and see bands live. So I grabbed, like I said, a dozen-ish, maybe 13, baker's dozen records that I wanted to talk about that are just excellent examples of hardcore punk that came out this year. Most of these I bought at Sorry State, and there's at least a handful that came out on the label as well. Very, very good, like, local bands. One record, speaking of local, we'll start with local, that I think blew away a lot of people this year. There's a Facebook group that I occasionally post in that's like a lot of older, older punks in their 40s and 50s that have been around in the scene for a long time. People that were in bands like Caustic Christ and House Rotten and pretty well-known people. Just post records, talk about the stuff they've been listening to. This was posted like a dozen times, I feel like. It's extremely well done. It was put out by a local label called Bunker Punks in split release with a label called Scrommel that I believe is from overseas. Not sure which country. I'll look it up and put a caption. This is the Screaming Death Comp. And this is just a true, I don't want to overuse the term labor of love, but you can tell that the Bunker Punks guys, Jeff and Woundman, just put a lot into making this a beautiful product. Not even saying anything about the music, all of which completely rips. But it's this kind of reverse board printed jacket. It comes with a huge poster that I won't unfurl with the artwork and this really nicely done insert. That's cool. Screaming Death. And this is kind of in the spirit of a lot of Japanese comps. I'm not the biggest Japanese hardcore guy. I know a fair amount about it. I like a lot of Japanese hardcore. Wouldn't call myself anything approaching an expert or anything like that, but I'm trying to think. There's like Starving Dog Bites Master and Eye of the Thrash Gorilla, I think is another one. There's a bunch of these compilations that have 4 to 6 bands, and it's almost like a compilation of EPs rather than just one song by a whole bunch of bands. And that's the way this is split up. It's almost like 4 7-inches on one LP. And it features 2 American bands, Destruct, who are from Richmond, Scarecrow from here in Raleigh. And then on the flip, you've got Dissekarad from Sweden and Rat Cage from the UK. And all these bands are very fast, very kind of D-beat driven. It's got a lot of them have that sort of discharge approach, but all have their own kind of thing, their own kind of spin on it. Destruct, I've seen numerous times come down since I moved here from RVA, and they always kill it. I feel like they kind of have a little bit of Japanese stuff like Bastard going on, a bunch of Scandinavian influences, they're very inertia driven, just really, really, really fast. The drummer hits the drums really hard. And the vocalist does have sort of a Cal from Discharge kind of execution that I really, really like. But they almost, to me, feel like the new school, whatever, the modern version of One Word Death Threat, the band from Memphis from the late 90s, early 2000s that featured members of His Hero Is Gone. Taking a lot of influence from very fast hardcore from around the globe that kind of borrows like D-beat drum patterns and stuff like that, but does their own thing with it. Super belt sander, abrasive guitar tone and bass tone. Everything's dialed up, but not ripping through the speakers. It's not blown out. You know, it's not like doing a noisy Xionos from Japan kind of thing. Everything's just perfectly dialed into where it needs to be. Scarecrow are very much along the same lines. Feels like maybe a little bit more American influence. I might just be thinking that because I know their guitarist is a big Poison Idea guy. But they kill it. There's a great kind of like moshy skank part that it breaks into on Space Race in here. Yeah! I made a mistake of reading the very, very good lyrics to the first song that Scarecrow does, Sixth Mass Extinction, about climate change and pretty much the apocalypse, and it really bummed me out. But that's how you know it's good hardcore. Yeah, great band too. They're the local band that I've seen not many times. I think like 3 or 4 times since I moved here, and they always kill it live. Really good folks too. Then you've got Massacred, the Swedish band that they're I'd say the crustiest and maybe the heaviest band on this compilation. Kang Punk or Mongol. I listen to enough of this stuff and I have enough of these records. I still don't know exactly where those genre names when it pertains to Swedish punk, how they apply. I know Mongol is supposed to be like heavier and crustier. They're approaching that. Really kind of abrasive kind of vocals. And Rat Cage from Britain, I'd say, are the most punk, like the most like kind of rocking out kind of punk kind of stuff. Probably have the most variation in tempo and that kind of thing. They've got a few parts that are reaching into a little bit more of an anthemic approach. But all very, very good stuff. I have a couple of other Rat Cage releases that are excellent too. And then I don't really need to say any more than what I already said about Destruct. I love that there's more and more bands like this nowadays that they kind of bring in that sort of raw punk influence, but maybe just kind of bring more like of a sense of musicianship and songwriting into it a little bit more deliberately, with songs that are a little bit more fleshed out. Another good example is Warthog from New York City, who are great. And this LP is fantastic. Cries the Mocking Mother Nature. Came out on Grave Mistake out of Richmond, but everything that I said applies to this. This is maybe produced a little louder than the tracks on there. Maybe produced better. But all the songs, including the songs from the LP, are great. This came out so early in 2023, I thought it was 2022. Hey, quick little intervention here. Little FD Signifier-esque editor's chair thing. It looks like Hardly a Dream, which I forgot to mention was the name of the Flower LP, was released digitally in late December of 2022. Interesting note, I also noticed it was recorded in 2020, so kind of sat there on the shelf for a while before it came out. The vinyl did not come out until March, so I don't know if that counts or not. It's a 2023 record for me. I know we're splicing hairs here, but there always seems to be somebody in the comments. You know how it goes. So just covering my bases. All right, back to the action. Briefly for a hot minute, and then I was like, oh yeah, the Flower came out in February, I think. This band is awesome. I think it's accurate to say that they sound a lot like Nausea from NYC, the legendary crust punk band that was around. When was Nausea around? 87 to 92 or something like that. They were around in the late 80s into the early 90s. Nausea has a very, very difficult sound to replicate, and I think the only way it can properly be replicated is if the people that play the music, worshiping them or whatever, understand their influences just as much. And I think that's the thing with Flower. They're not just trying to do a carbon copy of Nausea's sound. I think they really listen to the same bands that Nausea worshipped, namely like Amoebics and Discharge and Sacrilege, and it's very dense. I use the word sparingly because it's so overused, but there is a lot of atmosphere on this. Very gloomy and crushing. It has those great sort of tribal drum patterns that Roy Mayorga was so good at executing when he played in Nausea. It's just such a killer record. I listened to it incessantly when it came out. Gave it a few spins past couple of days, and it totally holds up. They were a force live. I saw them not long after this came out, or maybe it was before it even came out. It was around this time last year I caught them at a basement venue in Durham, and they were so good. So good. I highly recommend this. This has that classic, like the Nausea Extinction LP, this folds out into a gigantic folder, a gigantic poster. I'm not going to do that right now and show that off, but it's gorgeous. This very detailed, like Nick Blinko from Rudimentary Peni style art there. It's just a fantastic, heavy, metallic anarcho-punk record that you really owe it to yourself to check out if you can. I think it's still in print. Profane Existence put that out. Then there were a few bands that played the Sorry State Fest that I will mention here. Really impressive fest, by the way. Really well run. Great bands played. It wasn't anything excessive. There was 2 night shows that were pretty big. The first day of the fest had an after show that I didn't attend, and then the second day had like an afternoon show in an all-ages venue that was like a storefront that was also very, very cool. One band that I was exposed to via the fest that I hadn't heard yet was this band Personal Damage. They're from LA. They're from Southern California. And they're so good because they are bringing to mind all that awesome Southern California hardcore punk from the very early 80s. A lot of people, when you say, oh, it's got an LA hardcore sound or a Orange County hardcore sound or a Southern California hardcore sound, a lot of people immediately think of different things. Like they'll think of Uniform Choice, who are great. They'll think of Suicidal Tendencies, maybe, who are also awesome. In a modern context, people probably think of stuff like Terror. This captures a sound that I don't really hear a lot of people attempting or pulling off nowadays, which is like pre-goth TSOL. And the very first Vandals EP. Got this that sort of snotty yet detached kind of vocal execution that a lot of those bands had. That's just, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure like some dork in Europe can probably pull it off if they really, really study the music. You know, there's that sort of thing has been done before. Like MD Peterson's Army kind of did sort of a California meets DC kind of thing 20 years ago, you know, but I've never heard anybody really do that scene justice the way Personal Damage does. And they're from there, so it makes sense and it works. Then you've got the Illiterates from Pittsburgh, I think. Great scene there. Lots and lots and lots of good bands out of that burg. This is their second LP. I love this. No Experts. I think by a small margin, the album art on their first record wins, but this is still great. This Cro-Magnon guy holding the test tube and the mushroom cloud. It's just, you know, it's very to the point. Musically, honestly, like, I listened to it a couple times, liked it, and then shelved it, didn't think about it for a while, and I had it in my brain as sort of like, again, like sort of like an AMD Peterson's Army, or just kind of like a scrappy, fast, early 80s hardcore, like a little bit of the Circle Jerks, a little bit of DC hardcore. It's actually way more like meaner Northeastern now, revisiting it a bunch of times the past week than I thought. Not sure why I originally thought of it that way. It just goes to show, like, I should spend more time actually listening to records. But regardless, I'm going to listen to it more now. The vocal execution almost kind of reminds me of the singer from Antidote from New York City. Ray of Today, if the rah was turned way down, like way less obnoxious, but it has that sort of like snarl through the nose kind of vocal execution that a lot of like Northeastern kind of vocalists from the early 80s, hardcore punk vocalists have. Kind of reminds me of DYS in a lot of ways, and it's got some great fast, you know, circle mosh inducing parts. Kind of reminds me of some DC hardcore from the era, that much is true. But also has these great mid-tempo stomp, just like ba-na-na-na-na-na-na, kind of like DYS has, you know, in the Boston stuff. It's great. It's super good. Their first record's really, really great too. You know, it's an LP, but it's 12 minutes, as it should be. It's at this point that I slow myself down and mention that there will be links to all this stuff if you want to listen to it. Check it out, support it. This electric chair is incredible. They also played the fest. They probably put on the best set of the fest, although it's really difficult to say because there's so many good bands that played that. This band's from the Pacific Northwest. Great album art there. This came out on Iron Lung. I should mention, I'm so bad with mentioning what came out on what label. Never been good with that. Just to say, I mean, it was probably visible, but this came out on Sorry State. And let's backtrack. Dig through all my poly sleeves and my pile of crap here. This was on Test Subject Records, the Personal Damage. You can give credit where credit's due here. Sorry, folks. Alright, so Electric Chair. This came out on Iron Lung. I've got a couple more Iron Lung releases in this pile here for the best hardcore punk of 2023. This is a great slab of hardcore. And as I was talking about earlier, this is cool because it doesn't sound like they're trying to emulate a particular scene. Maybe I'm just woefully uneducated about certain eras, but I don't really think so. There's elements of it that kind of remind me of RKL and the Rich Kids on LSD. And there's elements of it that kind of remind me of Raw Power. And there's elements of it that remind me of Poison Idea. They really vary out the tempos like really well. There's moments that get to like almost like a sort of a Motorheadish like rocking out motor punk kind of thing, but they don't really vibe like that for more than a song or so. There's some good soloing, but it doesn't fall into like a crossover kind of category, even remotely. It still feels loose and frenetic enough to be considered hardcore punk, and it's great. They were banging at the show, at the fest. Very, very good. Savageheads were probably tied with them. I'll get to them in a minute. Can't forget Savageheads, but I don't want to get ahead of myself here. If we're going to veer off, also on Iron Lung, there's a nice twinned pairing of Power Violence style records that came out again at the beginning of 2023. This is Brain Tourniquet, An Expression of Pain. This band is from DC, I believe. They're a three-piece. This band does that really, really desperate, stark, monochromatic just ugly, hopeless power violence style, better than most. They capture a lot of that, ugly, fast, crossed out, and infest. We're talking blast beats, blurred, fast guitar chords, going into crawl, slow, sludgy kind of breakdowns. I think what kind of sets them apart from certain bands is they've really studied their Man is the Bastard, and a lot of people forget about how that band was considered part of that scene. Well, no, I don't think people forget about it, but I think when people think power violence, they immediately go to like Infest and Spaz and stuff. Man is the Bastard was such an oddball band that had so many weird noisy influences, and they really had more of a sludge thing going on than any of their compatriots. And I mean, exemplified by that is the song, the title song, An Expression of Pain, which takes up the entire side of side B, that has a lot of creepy crawly heaviness and weirdness to it. But yeah, both of these LPs are great because they really do a lot with when they slow things down. I'd say conversely to the sludgy elements on the Brain Tourniquet, the Woundman LP, Human Outline, their slow parts almost feel like Doom parts to me. It might just be me, who knows? It might just be because I'm such a nerd for the first couple of Cathedral records and St. Vitus and all that kind of stuff, but the heavy slow parts almost feel like doom metal as opposed to like a weird noisy sludge or something. This band features Trevor Vaughn as the chief songwriter, I believe, who's played in countless great bands from southern Massachusetts, a lot of which fall into that kind of fastcore, pissed hardcore, power violence, whatever kind of category. DFJ, who's played in a lot of bands, including Mind Erasers, also involved in this project. Trevor, I just recently got back into X-Files X. Hadn't listened to them in forever, which was like kind of the beginner band for a lot of people that jumped off and did other things, including Brendan Radigan, who, I mean, Google the guy's name. He's a guy that sang for Magic Circle and Rival Mob, who Trevor Vaughn also played in. But that's a great early pioneering kind of fast hardcore. I wouldn't say it's straight up power violence, but it's certainly of that era where it's just blindingly fast and kind of snarky and attitude laden. So Trevor's been playing in bands starting with X-Files X, I think, since, I don't know, the late 90s, early 2000s. And guy knows how to craft a song. So you've got really ugly, crossed out, Infest style hardcore on this. Again, like blurred fast, really pissed barking vocals going into heavy, almost doomish breakdowns here and there. And it's awesome. Just the riffs are fantastic. This band's been around for a grip. They did a record a couple of years ago that I also liked that I need to revisit. I remember it being a little bit more on the crusty side, but now I'm wondering if that's accurate. I'll need to check it out. But yeah, this came out on Iron Lung. I haven't really bothered to show off any center labels. I've been such a nerd for just showing off tapes and CDs that I don't do the whole proper YouTube vinyl thing of like, ooh, look at the stuff inside. But there you go. Yeah, great stuff. Great power violence. What's next? So we've got Suffer No Fool by No Time. Love that. Kind of pop art style. Devil on the cover there. I was excited to hear that this band came out with a new record. This is a pretty recent record. Came out in the past couple of months. Another Pittsburgh band. This is on TKO Records, which makes sense. TKO, I think it's still run by the guy from the Anti-Heroes. TKO puts out a lot of Oi stuff. More recently, they've done more like reissues of older hardcore bands, like Poison Idea. But in the 90s, it was all Oi. And it makes sense, because No Time does this great combination of street rock, Oi, skinhead kind of stuff with hardcore. And most of the time, I love that combination. I'm not quite as amped on it as I used to be, but I've always loved bands like 86 Mentality, who were a big deal almost 20 years ago now. And more recently, The Chisel from the UK. If you can have like fast, thrashy parts and then anthemic choruses and a guy that's, sounds like a drill sergeant at the helm, barking out catchy choruses, it's a win-win for me. I love these type of inner sleeves too. Printed inner sleeve with the rounded corners. Got this canine unit dog, looks like a German Shepherd, biting into a hand holding a police baton, so it's clear where their stance is on that sort of thing. It's called Suffer No Fool too. But all in all, this is great. They even go into a few kind of like chimey, blitz new age parts, you know, those kind of guitar lines, which is cool. Yeah, definitely a great release. I remember their last record being a little bit more on the hardcore side of things, and also having more of like a processed guitar tone. This has a really earthy, like big combo amp kind of sound to it. But again, their last record came out 4 years ago or something like that, I think. A number of years ago anyway, and I haven't listened to it in a while, so. Next up, we've got Chain Whip from Canada. This came out on Neon Taste Records. This band's evolution is cool. Again, one of those bands where I listened to their new record and I was like, something's different, and went back and listened to their previous record called 14 Lashes. And previously, they've always had a bit of like rock and roll in their sound in terms of like the catchiness of the riffs and that sort of thing. Just the structure of stuff feels a little bit more than straight up hardcore. It feels like their older stuff had a little bit more of like Boston hardcore, a little bit more of that Jack Choke Kelly vocal execution, that sort of baritone kind of thing. Newer bands like My Buddies and Black Sheep Squadron also was kind of like that, but did have more of a rough and tumble kind of snotty punk edge to it. This feels like they're moving even further towards like something that's almost garagey and rock and roll. I almost feel like it reminds me of a few bands like Henry Fiat's Open Sore and Dean Dirg from Germany, where there's just it's almost like half Crypt Records and half like early 80s American hardcore or something like that. The vocals are a little bit higher in register and a little bit more snotty, which is great. It's almost like, I don't know, like like the previously mentioned Choke like got his genes spliced with like Joey Vindictive or something like that. Yeah, just kind of a little bit more like meh, like attitude towards it, and a little less, I guess, raw testosterone or something. I also want to point out that not one but two Motorhead shirts are represented in the lineup there, so that makes me happy. But yeah, great hardcore. Again, this is, you know, an LP, but it's 13 songs. It's over in, I think, like 15 minutes. And then we've got Gel, Only Constant. Came out on Convulse Records. This has a cool color, so I'll show that off. I had copies of this in my distro. Both of them sold out. I know one of them ended up in the hands of Mike Seatown. Hi, Mike. I wish I had the previous color, which was like that cool Coke bottle clear. I'm not a big colored vinyl person. I'm certainly not one to collect more than one variant with new bands. But man, I love that Coke bottle color. It's just so cool, that kind of bluish. It's nice. This is this kind of weird, I don't know, like caramel and mustard kind of color. Anyway, Gel is one of these bands. I think they're kind of on the perimeter of a lot of the other stuff that I've been talking about. A little less of like a genre study. I mean, they certainly have an influence from early 80s hardcore. They're kind of this part of this new crop of bands. A lot of them seemingly, for whatever reason, only have like one syllable in the name. You know, Gel, Spy, all that kind of newer stuff. A lot of these bands, I feel like kind of the sound kind of started to bubble up a while ago with bands like Hoax and even Sexvid and stuff like that. That was this raw, kind of feral, vague lyrical topics, kind of personal, weird. I don't know. It was something that was definitely newer, coming out of like DIY hardcore at the time, and it feels like these newer crop of bands like Gel and Spy and a handful of others are really focusing it into something just really accessible, but also awesome. And Gel, very pissed band. In a lot of ways, some of their sound reminds me of Think I Care from Boston, who are a very like negative band that borrowed a lot from like Sheer Terror and Negative Approach and Infest. But again, this is all being kind of, I don't know, kind of boiled down and synchronized into something different altogether. They're a newer band. and they're blowing up in popularity for a good reason. Samantha's vocals are venomous as hell. There's a certain amount of like reverb on them. I feel like earlier bands that kind of played in this style had the really, really echoey, like a detractor of this style that I know from Syracuse once called it yelling into a garbage can style of vocal approach. Again, this is dialed back to where it's accessible. There's a little bit of a tweak to the effect on it, but it really works for the sound. And there's a lot of, again, like stompy parts, kind of like I was talking about with the Illiterates, with like da na 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 na, just a mid-tempo like pounding, definitely like stomping side to side in the mosh pit kind of vibe with a lot of the riffs, which isn't too dissimilar to a lot of stuff. But I've noticed a few things in the music that kind of set this apart from bands that have a relatively similar sound. Namely, there's some almost kind of like jazzy drumming at one point in this. There's this cool mellow like sort of hip hop track at the end with like answering machine messages on it that almost reminded me of that one Cold World track, if you know Cold World, this kind of like almost like hip hop style thing at the end. There's a lot of different variations in tempo going on in this, and with the pissed vocal approach and just overall really awesome like heavy sound really being dialed in with the volume and distortion of the guitars, it comes out really, really well. It's a really well put together hardcore record. So a band that is definitely hyped right now and a lot of people talk about, but I think it's absolutely 100% deserved. So Gel Only Constant. And then at the end of the LPs, we've got a band called Stigmatism, Ignorance in Power. This I was really excited about. I hadn't heard anything about this band. It's one of those things that kind of came out of nowhere. Not that I'm totally dialed into everything going on in hardcore these days, but I hadn't heard about this coming out until it just came out. This band put out a 7-inch, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. I believe this band actually is from New York, but I'm not. I mean, it says NYC 2023 right there, so I mean, if I'm wrong, I'll correct it. But very, very indebted to classic NYHC, classic New York hardcore. I'd say New York hardcore pre the Breakdown 87 demo being a game changer that kind of started to involve rhythmically a little bit of hip-hop influence and way more kind of metal riffing. New York hardcore prior to that had a distinct sound. If you've paid attention to like all the documentaries and stuff, New York hardcore actually kind of came into its own a little bit later than hardcore blew up nationally. You know, bands like Agnostic Front and the Cro-Mags were really meeting a high level of success when it was kind of on a downturn in the rest of the country. But when I think of this and its sound, definitely Agnostic Front, their first 7-inch and their first LP, United Blood and Victim in Pain, respectively. But also, I mean, you could say Antidote, you could say The Abused, stuff like that, just very driving, something about the vocal execution being, and the way that it's interlaced with the rhythmic approach, it's just very New York. It's just spat out in a certain way that is just so definitively New York hardcore. But yeah, if you like the first couple of AF records, you can't go wrong with this. Vocally, I mean, he's not doing the Roger Murray Tasmanian Devil thing, really. It's more, reminds me more of Jerry A from Poison Idea, to be honest. That's just my opinion. It's also kind of front-loaded. Like, I like the first half of the record. It's pretty good, but I feel like they really start to rage on side B. So that's how I feel about that. This also has a massive lyric sheet poster that I'm not going to unfold. But let's take a look at the vinyl. It's black. And it's also complete. Oh, okay, it's completely blank on one side, like a bootleg. So, pretty stripped down. I would mention also that this is screen printed. It's got that nice matte, like screen printed feeling to it. So these were probably like pressed DIY style, which is cool. NYC hand screen printed. Maybe it was just put out by the band themselves, I don't know. No information about the label, so we'll just leave it at that. All right, now I have a pile of LPs that need to be re-sleeved. There's a whole ton of other releases that I could have talked about as well that were great. There's a bunch of stuff that came out on Roachleg Records last year that I grabbed from my distro. People's Temple, that's a really good 7-inch. Axxe Crazy tape, which is a really great crust band. I don't have any of that in front of me, but I'll leave links. One thing Also, a scene that I was sad to leave behind, as I stated earlier, that has put out a few really awesome releases this year has been the Boston scene. Savageheads came down to play the fest. I knew a couple of those guys. It was nice to catch up with them and everything. They put out an excellent, excellent kind of street punk, pogo punk record last year, full length, that has a great, like, really energetic, like, kind of rhythmic approach. If you're familiar with, like, a lot of the UK 82 stuff, it borrows a lot from the Partisans, who are one of the best bands to do that kind of style. But this little crew of dudes, this group of people, do a really, really good job wearing their influences on their sleeves when it comes to UK 82 stuff, all the Riot City bands, stuff like that. The Savageheads tape was for sale at the fest. This is just a 4-song tape, 4-song demo that includes 3 originals and a cover from that band, The Insane, one of those 82 bands. A little bit more variation on this. I mean, it's only 3 songs and a cover, but I feel like, the tempo varied enough on the LP to keep things interesting, but there's, I think it's They Follow. The second song's a little bit like slower, a little bit more like anthemic, slower kind of style. So it sounds like they're kind of expanding their sound a little bit. Really, really good band, Savageheads. And then you've got the Massacred, who kind of, I feel like, I mean, if you're just a layperson like me, I don't really go too deep into all that Riot City stuff and all that UK 82 stuff. A lot of it's really good, but I have a bunch of Punk and Disorderly compilations and stuff like that I'll dip into. I would say if you like vintage, prime era exploited stuff, you'd like the Massacred. There's probably some other bands like Blitzkrieg and Ultraviolence and stuff that they're pulling from, but it's just stripped down, gnarly, fucking UK style punk, early 80s UK style punk. And it's great. This came out on, all these were put out on Active 8 Records, which is Mark, who plays in both bands, I believe, his label. So, and this is a tape. The 7-inch came out early this year. The tape just came out like in time for the fest. Tape's got a bunch of stuff that's going to come out on an EP, plus some live tracks. And yeah, just, gnarly, not really D-beat, just kind of upbeat, pissed off, political punk stuff, Massacred. So check that out, get into it. And yeah, that's about it for now. Let's get down to editing this bad boy. Okay, until next time, everybody be good, have a good time, be safe, take care. Pat GZS out.